She had learned to move like the air in the hotel lobby, unnoticed until a tray needed balancing, a smile deployed, a problem smoothed. That invisibility had been both her shield and her sentence. Mei Lin carried sketches folded like secret promises in the inner pocket of her apron, dress silhouettes that lived more vividly in the margins of her receipts than in any closet she could afford. She was a waitress at the Crescent Orchid, a glittering venue where the city's new money and old dynasties met over champagne and carefully choreographed civility. Tonight, the Orchid's lights reflected off chandelier crystals and the dozen cameras, because the Red Star Design Competition was the headline sponsor, and the lobby hummed with press and nerves. If pride could bruise, it had been bruised thin and often in Mei Lin's life. Her adoptive mother, Mrs. Zhou, had taught her the economy of quiet. How to apologize even when apology was not deserved. How to apologize for not being somebody else. Mrs. Zhou's voice carried in Mei Lin like a map she had learned by heart. Keep your head down, don't take up space, repay every kindness with obedience. But there were things Mrs. Zhou could not govern. The curve of a collar on a page, the way light caught linen, the stubborn rhythm in Mei Lin's hand when she sketched. Those private acts of creation had sustained her more than wages or promises from the charity that had taken her in as a girl. A frayed photograph, taped awkwardly to the sketchbook's first page, was another sustenance. 2 small faces, a ping-on buckle awkwardly visible on a small coat, and a child's smile smeared by time. She carried the photo like a compass. If you like stories where a lowly underdog refuses to stay down, stay with this one. Hit subscribe and like, and you won't miss how a single desperate choice rearranges lives. The clerk at the registration desk asked Mei Lin for a refill without looking up. The warmth of the tray was a small anchor. She threaded through guests, murmuring apologies into the throb of conversation. Then she rounded the corner and collided with Wen Qing. Wen Qing wore entitlement like a signature. Her laugh was licensed and sharp. Tonight she had on a silk dress cut to command attention and a smile that worked like a knife, meant to expose mistakes and then point to the door. She was the daughter of one of the sponsors, a socialite with investments in other people's reputations, and a known rival to anyone who caught the judge's eye without first passing through her orbit. "You're in the wrong place," Wen Qing said coolly, as if the hotel were her private salon and Mei Lin an intrusive draft. Her words were small and carefully aimed. "This area is for guests, for professionals." Mei Lin's tray trembled. A droplet of jasmine tea struck the carpet like a dark, accusing dot. The room hushed for a breath, the way an audience inhales before the aria. Camera shutters clicked. Someone had nudged the press to angle this way. Wen Qing's friends smirked. Mei Lin felt her face brand with the heat of shame, heavy and radioactive. She tried to steady the tray, to apologize with all the humility that had been trained into her. "I'm sorry," she began. "Watch where you're going, peasant," Wen Qing said, as if the word were a medal she'd been awarded for cruelty. The laughter that followed was small and surgical. Someone filmed it on their phone. The clip began its own life before the tea had cold time to set. A man's voice cut across the shallow laughter. It was low and amused, the kind measured by someone who had never learned to watch his step for public opinion. "Is that how you greet service staff here? A charming spectacle." He looked at Wen Qing with a patient, almost indulgent gaze, as if the world were a theater and she merely playing a part she'd rehearsed. Mei Lin looked up. The stranger stood 2 steps behind Wen Qing, a broad-shouldered silhouette against the light, wearing a coat that seemed designed to make a figure like his an essential backdrop. He had come from nowhere. One moment an unremarked pair of hands in the crowd, the next a presence that altered space. He reached out, took the tray with quick, efficient fingers, and steadied Mei Lin with the other. The severity in his eyes softened when they met hers, and something unanticipated slid through her like warm water. She could have called him helpful and left it at that, but the cameras were still alive, and Wen Qing's mischief had found its audience. Wen Qing's voice rose then, the hymnal of a woman who loved spectacle. "Who are you to touch the staff's work?" she asked. "Do you play actor, sir? Are you with one of our competitors?" The stranger smiled, and that small action was not the same as the grin of a celebrity. It was an instruction to consider the possibility of defiance. "I'm just a man who dislikes unnecessary cruelty," he said, "and I don't like people being humiliated in front of cameras." The laughter stuttered, rerouted. Wen Qing's jaw tightened. There was hunger in the room now, the hungry attention of people who smelled a story. Without thinking, because sometimes the mind has to step aside for survival, Mei Lin did what she had never done in her life. She felt the old, hollowed-out place inside her fill with a sudden, dangerous clarity. The next breath held the sort of audacity that refuses to be annihilated by shame. She leaned forward and pressed a quick, blunt kiss to the stranger's cheek. It was not graceful. It was not meant to be art. It was a rescue, a sudden act that reframed humiliation into something other people would have to explain. For a heartbeat, the crowd did not move. The camera shutters caught the motion like a constellation. Then the room exploded into noise, gasps, the flutter of handheld devices going live, a dozen different versions of the story trying to outrun each other. Wen Qing's face contorted from amusement to fury. "What is wrong with you?" she hissed. The stranger's mouth curved in a way that said he was not offended. His hand tightened around the tray, then released it with a flourish like someone ending a performance. "Brave," he said softly to Mei Lin, so that no one could have recorded it cleanly with their feeds. "Very brave." People began to crowd, retell, retweet. Someone called out, "Who is he?" as if a person like him could suddenly be plucked into the civic ledger of notoriety. The hotel's manager swooped in, mortified and apologetic, and Mei Lin felt the safety of being swept away by procedure for one small, trembling second. Later, behind the service door where the staff kept their private thrum of exhaustion, Mei Lin leaned against the cool tile and laughed at the audacity of her own lips. "You kissed a stranger," she told herself. "You kissed someone who could ruin you." Then she folded back the sketchbook in her palm and pressed her thumb against the frayed photograph. The Ping An buckle gleamed in the small picture like a punctuation mark. She did not notice the laughter leaking from the next room into her skin, the laughter of someone who had been watching. He did not demand her name then. He did not ask for a number. He left the tray with a nod and a promise of silence that he would not offer publicly, and then, to the staff watching with hungry curiosity, waved a hand and moved on. Mei Lin's moment of rebellion receded into a new kind of visibility. The clip would travel faster than private repair. By the time she clocked out, a dozen messages waited on Mrs. Zhao's old phone. A text from an unknown account forwarding a news clip, and 100 mean-spirited comments from strangers who thought internet cruelty was a sport. Mrs. Zhao's face in the narrow kitchen was not the face of a mother so much as a ledger's page filling with numbers. "You are unlucky," she said, not unkindly. Her brand of concern was direct and transactional. "You bring attention. Do you know what that does? It makes people decide about you before they know you." Mei Lin wanted to tell her everything, how strange the man smelled of cedar and the sea, how his fingers had been warm and exact when they studied the tray. Instead, she pressed the photograph to her chest, feeling the outline of the Ping An buckle through paper like a memory of someone else, maybe the reason she had always kept her head down. Mrs. Zhao's lips pursed. The photograph's edges had been softened by the oil of Mei Lin's thumb. "Keep your head down," Mrs. Zhao said again. "Not everyone who looks like a protector is a friend." But the city, which has its own appetite for narrative, had already begun to stitch the clip to 1,000 imaginings. Headlines called the unknown man mysterious benefactor. A blogger insinuated that he might be a new patron of the arts. The combination of Mei Lin's desperate kiss and the man's implacable calm made the clip irresistible, a pithy little rebellion for an audience that worshipped spectacle. 2 days later, the man found her not by chance, but because his assistant had run the hotel's guest list and found a match: the Crescent Orchid's staff roster. He arrived at the squat little apartment she shared with Mrs. Zhao as if it were an appointment to be kept, but his presence felt like an event. "You kissed me to save yourself," he said in the hallway before he had even reached the door. His voice was the same low thing as in the lobby, but now it carried an additional softness, as if he had replayed the encounter and found it more interesting in reflection than in action. Mei Lin's first instinct was to shut the door, to slap the lock into place and return to the safety of anonymity. Instead, she opened it a fraction, the chain still clasped, so she could measure him through a thin seam of security. "Then why are you here?" He studied her like someone reading the margins of a book for the first time. He was taller than she had thought, and his suit had been tailored by someone whose loyalty was to minimalism and impeccable lines. "Because of the pictures," he said. "They're everywhere. They say a lot of things. I wanted to know what the truth was in the middle of the noise." There was a hum in the apartment, the city beyond the window, the conduit of a neighbor's television, Mrs. Zhao's soft, wary footsteps inside. Mei Lin held the door by the chain and considered the stranger's candor. "I am not the sort of person your headlines imagine," she said. He smiled in a way that bent the sentence into something generous rather than skeptical. "Maybe not. I have seen people improvise courage," he said. "But I must confess, I am not indifferent to the spectacle. It was entertaining. I thought I might come and offer a different kind of amusement." His eyes flicked to the shelf where her sketchbook lay, and Mei Lin felt the same heat of exposure again. This time different, less dangerous, but still a raw tenderness. "You found my sketches?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not yet." Then, as if to balance the moment that threatened to tilt into private invasion, he held out a hand toward the photograph clutched in her palm. "May I?" She hesitated for a breath, then handed it over. He turned the photograph between his fingers with a slow kind of reverence, the ping-on buckle catching the light and reflecting it in a sliver of interest. He did not laugh. He did not comment on the cheap tape. His expression softened. "This buckle," he said, like a man annotating a clue in a case. "It belongs to a family something like mine. I've seen it before." He did not say more, and that omission stretched the hallway like a line on a page that had been left intentionally blank. Mei Lin felt the world condense into the photograph, and the air wrapped tightly around it. "What is your name?" she asked then, because the shape of conversation demanded formality if she was to stay anchored. She wanted to map him to a person rather than to a rumor. "Shu Jin," he said. "I work with textiles, among other things." The vagueness of that answer was deliberate, she sensed. "I have a company that sponsors Red Star. I was in the lobby because I was watching tonight's finalists. I did not expect to be rescued by a stranger." He had the kind of hands that could sign a check while still showing the remnants of work, fingers that hinted at both business and craft. Mei Lin remembered the way they had steadied the tray, and felt a flicker of gratitude, and another thing she did not yet name, an odd trust that arrived not from light, but from the presence of someone who could have exploited her and chose not to. The following night he called her to the Crescent Orchid, under the pretext of offering her work, an internship at the textile house he owned, an opportunity that sounded like an answer to a prayer she had been afraid to voice. The position would pay more than her current wages, would put a name to the sketches she carried to her head at night, and would plant her in the orbit of the design community she dreamed of. But there were conditions. His assistant would bring a contract. It was, Xu Jin said, a short-term arrangement meant to formalize her time at his atelier so she could prove herself without the noise that accompanied sudden attention. Work, he insisted, as if reminding her of something sacred. No theatrics. If you accept, you will be an apprentice, not a curiosity. She wanted to say yes with 1,000 nods. She wanted to fold that contract into her sketchbook and sleep on it like a talisman. Instead, she asked one question that had been sitting behind the photograph in her mind for years. What if I am who I appear to be already? Just a waitress, she asked. Will you still offer me a chance? Xu Jin's look held a complexity she wasn't ready to decode. If you are honest, he said, I will offer you a chance. I hire for truth, not reputation. Then he added quietly, and I have my own reasons to favor truth. The truth in his voice sounded like an invitation as well as a warning. Mei Lin accepted the internship. It felt like the right kind of step. A door opened without the pretense of charity. But there were other doors that would not stay closed. The video that had been meant as a momentary humiliation began to work for her too. Journalists called, influencers requested interviews, and suddenly the industry she had only glimpsed from the periphery wanted to know who this brave, impulsive woman was. That new attention pressed at other people's edges. Wen Qing watched with an expression that was a map of calculation. Mrs. Zhou did not smile as she counted potential income. And in a conference room 3 floors above the atelier, a man named Qin Dong, an influential patron and an early investor in Xu Jin's brand, listened as the CEO's assistant described an unplanned public relations coup. Qin Dong's interest prickled with something personal, not merely strategic. He had his own ledger to balance. The internship gave Mei Lin access to fabrics she had only ever sketched. Wool cut with precision, silk that held a dye like a secret. She breathed in dye fumes the way other people might inhale music. Xu Jin gave her tasks that were small and then larger, to rework a sleeve, to redraw a collar, to produce a sample under pressure. In the quiet hours of the atelier, she folded ribbons and rehearsed designs in the margins of her mind. Her hands began to speak in the language of stitches. She learned to coax a line from cloth the way one coaxed a confession from a tired witness. But in the background, the city did not stop chewing its narratives. Wen Qing found a way to weaponize the clip. She claimed that Mei Lin had staged the kiss to gain access to a man of influence, insinuating that Mei Lin's intentions were calculated and disingenuous. Bloggers ran pieces about women who manipulate and men who are too kind by half. A rival designer accused Mei Lin of plagiarism, an allegation that arrived on a gloved hand of convenience, and with documents smeared enough to make the accusation look plausible to casual readers. Mei Lin felt the air press in around her again, but it pressed differently this time. She was no longer the solitary waitress who had to apologize for being seen. She was someone with an internship, a portfolio, and, quietly, a supporter in Xu Jin. She also had the photograph, the ping-an buckle tucked away in the pencil roll of her bag like a seed. You must be careful, Xu Jin told her once, in the atelier's small kitchen where steam rose from a kettle like a stage curtain. People conflate appearance and intent. Your kiss was brave, but it was also evidence. People will try to read it against you. Let your work be the reply you want to give. She wanted to argue about courage, about moments that do not fit easily into the world's categories. But instead, she made tea and held the cup like a small peace offering to her own nerves. They say I staged it, she muttered. They say I wanted to be famous. Xu Jin watched her with a tenderness that was neither pity nor ownership. Then we will make them look ridiculous, he said simply. We will build a truth so large that the rumor has to step back. Building truth would require more than stubborn creativity. It required evidence, the kind that could not be waved aside by a clever friend with a phone. It required the same quality of patience Mei Lin had learned to pour into a hem. Meticulous, invisible labor that, when finally revealed, made the garment whole. Her first test arrived in the form of an accusation so public it threatened to unpick everything she had begun to build. A prominent designer, a judge on the Red Star panel, alleged that one of the sketches Mei Lin had shown Xu Jin's atelier had been lifted from an older, established catalog. The accusation was a tidal wave. Clients nervous to be associated, a canceled meeting, whispers of legal action. The sample she had spent nights perfecting, the one she believed would speak for her, was now a point of contention. She felt the old familiar pull of retreat. The city loved a scandal and then moved on. She had no desire to be the spectacle that sustained anybody's entertainment. "We will contest this," Xu Jin said, and his voice was the sort of certainty that moved like a lever on machinery. "We will trace the drafts, the timestamps, the fabric swatches. Plagiarism is specific. It requires an act. We will show the act did not occur." Mei Lin wanted to trust him with the same intensity as when she had pressed a kiss to a stranger's cheek in the lobby. Trust not born of glamour, but of a belief that someone else could protect the integrity of the work that lived in her bones. She nodded, and in that nod there was a small, fierce pact. Across town, Wen Xing sat in a lacquered suite and plotted the next public humiliation. Her hand hovered over her phone, tapping out a message to the influencer who loved chaos. This competition would not be a place to lose status. She could not imagine losing the narrative she had spent years curating, of being at the center of things, of orchestrating who rose and who fell. If Mei Lin intended to climb, Wen Xing would be there to pull the chair away. The conflict focused attention on the upcoming Red Star Showcase, where designers would present in front of a panel and a live audience. For Mei Lin, this was no longer a private trial of competence. It was a venue where truth and reputation would collide. She had sketches that trembled with possibility and a pair of hands that could translate them into fabric. She had Xu Jin's support and the lingering echo of a stranger's amusement when she had kissed him. She did not know then that the man in the lobby had his own history braided with the ping-on buckle in her photograph. That the buckle might be the simplest thread to pull that would tie her private past to the public present. She did not yet understand that the choice she had made on impulse would demand an accounting, not only of her courage, but of a past that certain people had spent years trying to bury. And she did not yet know that, when the contest lights rose and the crowd inhaled, the city would be ready for a revelation that would change who was allowed to claim what name. On the morning the finalists were announced, Mei Lin stood at the edge of the atelier and watched the hands of the old clock rise like a judge's gavel. The sample dress lay on the table, its hem pinned like a small argument about what was beautiful and who had the right to make it. Xu Jin had asked her to trust the process. Qin Dong had offered quiet counsel from the boardroom threshold. Wen Qing had already begun to smile on camera, polishing a victory that was not yet hers. Mei Lin smoothed the fabric with a hand that still trembled with the memory of the lobby. The photograph in her bag felt heavier. The ping-on buckle showed like a punctuation mark through the paper. She had never thought courage would arrive as such a public thing, like a hand reaching out where everyone could see. She had hoped it would be private, a thing she could keep between stitches. But the world, as always, had other designs. When the limousine arrived to pick her up for the showcase, she stepped onto the sidewalk and found Xu Jin waiting. He held the back of the car door open with the same practiced courtesy, and for an unaccountable second she felt the absurd, bright hope that everything could be made right simply by being present and honest. He leaned close. "Will you promise me, Mei Lin," he said, honest and clipped, "that if things get ugly, you will tell the truth, even if it is not the version that looks best on camera?" She looked at him and remembered the kiss and the photograph and the line of stitches she had learned on the job. "I will," she said. He nodded once, a motion like a seal. "Then let us go make a show of the truth." They drove toward the auditorium where the lights were already finding their places and the judges skimmed their notes. Behind the scenes, Wenqing rehearsed her smile. The influencers aligned their angles. The city settled like an audience on the rim of a breath. And somewhere in the flutter of anticipation, Qin Dong's phone beeped with an incoming file, a document with a chain of custody note that belonged to a lab he trusted. It was a small, unremarkable file that, if opened, could make the ping-on buckle in Mei Lin's photograph mean more than anyone had guessed. Mei Lin did not know what the file contained. She did know that when the curtain rose and the first dress was revealed, everyone in the room, judges, sponsors, cameras, and Wenqing, would be watching her not simply for her designs, but for the story they had been informed to expect. The stage lights warmed her face. The orchestra's pre-show hum filtered through the dressing room door. Xu Jin set the hem with fingers that were steady and kind, and then he looked up and said in a voice that had the same quiet gravity as when he had steadied her in the lobby, "When they shout, do not flinch." Outside, the world waited with its private agendas, and Mei Lin, with the photograph folded near her heart and the ping-on buckle a secret weight, felt the strange sensation of walking toward a future that had been shaped by a desperate kiss and by people who would insist on discovering what that kiss meant. The applause, the cameras, the spectacle, they were all about to become a crucible. A moment later, Wenqing took the stage, and the auditorium exhaled. Mei Lin gripped the dress and imagined every stitch as a truth she could reveal. She thought of the photograph, the buckle, and the man who had studied her hands. She thought of Mrs. Wen. Zoe, of the leases unpaid, and the polite ledger of survival that had been her training. She straightened her spine and walked into the light. Behind the velvet curtain, Xu Jin met Qin Dong's eye across the room. The file on Qin Dong's phone blinked, unread, like a sleeping thing. Neither of them had yet decided how to wake it. The city hummed with potential violence and tenderness. Somewhere in that frequency, the secret of Mei Lin's past trembled, ready to be struck. And when the competition judges rose to speak, when Wenqing smiled and the cameras lingered, the truth would begin to edge toward daylight. The spotlight on Wenqing was a thin, hot blade. She spoke of craft, of lineage, of the responsibility a designer had to history and to taste. Her words were a practiced lacquer, glossy, unblemished, and the cameras accepted them like a favor returned. The judges nodded as if to a ritual. The influencers leaned forward with faces lighted by screens. Someone in the front row tapped, quick and secretive, at a phone. Mei Lin could hear the orchestra's strings like a tide under everything, and beneath that tide her own heartbeat was a small, insistent drum. She remembered Xu Jin's instruction, "When they shout, do not flinch," and she bent her hands into the shape of composure. The dress lay across her arm as if it were an appendage of herself. Every stitch, every seam, was a sentence she might read aloud. She walked onto the stage as the host called her name, and for a beat the auditorium looked like a map of human expectation. Faces turned, devices lifted, mouths anticipatory. "Mei Lin," the host said, warm, the practiced kindness of someone who had to pronounce other people's narratives into being. "Tell us about this piece." She set the dress on the mannequin with the care of a small ceremony. The ping-on buckle hid under a fold of silk. She had not meant to carry it into the light, but it rested against the fabric like a secret breathing. She placed her hands on the waistline and spoke in a voice that wanted to be small and steady. "This collection," she began, "is about the ledger we all carry. how we account for the lives behind a seam. It is about the hands that have no witnesses, about the ways we stitch dignity back into clothing when the ledgers are empty. A few appreciative murmurs rustled through the crowd. Wen Qing's smile tightened into a blade of attention. Mei Lin's words were simple, true. Mrs. Zhou's unpaid lease and the ledger of lessons had taught her the language. She had expected applause. She had not expected the soft, deliberate whisper that cut the air like paper. From the judges' table near the aisle, a man in a gray jacket raised a hand and asked a question about provenance, about influences, and the ethical sourcing of materials. Mei Lin answered, careful to remain within the frame of her craft. The man nodded and wrote, and a young judge with a bright, angular haircut asked, in the language of prestige, whether she could speak to authenticity. The word landed like a pebble. Mei Lin felt its small, concentric rings widening toward her ribs. At the back row, Qin Dong's phone screen blinked again, this time with an attachment that had been sent by a laboratory he trusted. A chain of custody log, a timestamp, a photograph of the buckle itself under magnification. He had been staring at it for the length of a breath, weighing the weight of an action like a man at a branch point on a road. He tapped. The PDF opened. The lab's header coolly declared its impartiality. The images showed the buckle's metal composition, a close-up of the maker's mark beneath layers of patina, and, beneath the photograph, a notation. Sample received from agent WQ-PR-19. Chain of custody verified. Authentic manufacture, Ping An, Oyster Collection, serial 00418. Qin Dong's mouth made a quiet shape. He read the timestamps. The sample was logged 3 years before the photograph had supposedly been taken. The chain traced through an agent with the initials that matched an email alias he'd seen on Wen Qing's PR contact list. The file felt like a small implosion that might shatter a prop. He looked up and found Xu Jin's eye across the aisle. Xu Jin's face, which had been so steady for Mei Lin, registered a fraction of the disquiet Qin Dong felt. There was intelligence there, a slow reconfiguration as if someone were rerouting a map mid-journey. Qin Dong did not need to speak. He pressed the screen down, thumb over the single image that could overturn an image. Backstage, Mei Lin was finishing the phrasing she had rehearsed a dozen times. She would speak of truth in stitches. She would own the photograph if called, and she had decided that owning it would mean naming the man in it not as accusation but as confession. She imagined the photograph unfolded on the stage lights like a map of a night that had once been private. The audience would sign each margin of her life with their attention. Wen Qing finished her segment and returned to the wings amid Perfune's congratulations. Her handlers were already clustering. A PR operative with lacquered nails placed a hand on her elbow and whispered. Wen Qing's smile did not flicker. She was the kind of person who could tighten a jaw and make it look like regal resolve. She watched Mei Lin with the poised interest of a predatory art critic examining a potential rival's brushstroke. On the dais, the chief judge cleared his throat. "We will now open the floor for comments," he said, and he glanced at the program, then toward the cameras, "for any relevance to the themes of authenticity and provenance that so many of you have raised tonight." A ripple of polite laughter. Mei Lin took the proffered microphone. Her palms were warm. Her tongue felt like a thread pulling through her mouth. She thought of Mrs. Zhou's hands, calloused and small, of the ledger scratched with a pencil that sometimes ended without numbers. She thought of the kiss and the photograph and the buckle like a small, stubborn coin. "If I can add," she said, voice finding a room of its own, "what I want to say is that garments carry histories. They carry proof not of guilt or innocence, but of moments when one human being touched another. My work is to make that contact visible without turning people into evidence." A camera found the photograph folded against her chest. In the projection of the lens, the ping-on bugle edged like a punctuation mark. Somewhere, an influencer breathed an intake of air. Other cameras turned toward Wenqing as if to catch her reaction like prey. Wenqing's assistant, lips unnaturally pink, leaned forward and tapped a message into a device. The message was short. WQ, PR, confirm. The assistant's thumbs moved with the same decisive calm that could turn rumor into headline. On the other side of the room, a producer, a man responsible for stage feeds, felt the buzz on his device and, out of protocol and curiosity, forwarded one of the files to the technical director. A chain of custody log marked WQ PR 2019. The technical director had access to the stage screens. He opened the attachment. The image was clinical and precise, a magnified shot of the buckle with the maker's mark visible in the lower right corner. He scrolled. Beneath the lab image was a scanned receipt and an email trail with an attached PDF that included the agent's identifier, WQPR 2019, the same code Wenqing's assistant had just sent. The director looked at the stage, at Mei Lin's hands smoothing the tress, at the host smiling a smile that expected nothing more than spectacle. He thought of the rules about live feeds, how rarely a stage set was used to adjudicate matters of truth, but he also thought of the nature of a moment when truth and theater collided. His finger hovered over the command that could project the PDF on the big screen behind the runway. Xu Jin had moved closer to the edge of the stage, ostensibly to adjust the hem that by now no longer needed adjusting. From the side, he watched Qin Dong and then the technical director's hesitance. Xu Jin's jaw worked subtle as if chewing an idea. He could feel the panic in Mei Lin's back as if it were his own. He had promised her steadiness. The promise had a cost. "Miss Mei Lin," the host said, when Mei Lin paused, "you speak eloquently about contact. How do you answer those who might say a photograph is evidence and not art?" Before she could answer, a sudden flurry of motion. From the control room, the technical director made the decision. The screen ignited behind the runway with a white, clinical clarity. The lab header appeared, then the magnified buckle, then the chain of custody notation. In the auditorium's hush, the printed words read, slow and inexorable. Sample received from agent, WQ PR 2019. Chain of custody verified. There was a physical sound to the realization, like the first domino that nudges a whole arrangement into fall. Wenqing's smile, which had been a polished thing of intent, thinned. The PR operative's hand, mid-gesture, stilled. Mei Lin felt the photograph in her bag like a presence that no longer belonged to her alone. The audience exhaled 1,000 small falls of air. Wenqing stepped forward. Her voice, when it came, was cool, authoritative, practiced. "This is an unfortunate misunderstanding," she said. "It appears there has been an overlap of provenance records. As designers, we stand for clarity. If any piece presented tonight is misrepresented, we will, of course, investigate." The words were a maneuver, but the screen did not yield. Below the chain of custody was an additional line, a line the technician had not expected to see until he'd scrolled. An email header from WQPR 2019 to LabTech at Veritas, timestamp 3 years ago. Subject line, "Please confirm sample authenticity, urgent, ping and detail included." The email body was brief and businesslike. Qin Dong's hand found his phone again. He scrolled, then, with a motion less theatrical than necessary, stood. He did not shout. He did not even rise with the fury of a man taking a stand. He rose because there was a decency he could not deny himself. His voice, when it emerged, was a low thing that crossed the auditorium like a current. I work with the lab that sent this report, he said. If these are the records you hold, he nodded toward the big screen, they indicate that the sample was logged in prior to the photograph. That raises questions about who had custody of the buckle and why it would appear in a photograph with Miss Mei Lin. Cameras pivoted. Wen Qing's expression, 1 second polished, next split into two faces, control and alarm. A murmur threaded through the seats. The chief judge frowned. The program in his hands seemed suddenly inadequate. Someone in the press pit tapped a rapid message. Live, possible provenance link to Wen Q's PR. Mei Lin felt as if the floor under her had become a moving thing. She had come prepared to make a confession, to name the man in the photograph, and to take the consequences. But this was not how she had imagined the truth arriving. The buckle was no longer merely a badge of a private night. It had become a node in a network of custodianship, a ledger that implicated an agent and perhaps the designer herself. Wen Qing's voice hardened into the kind of calm that exists only a heartbeat before a storm. "Mr. Qin," she said, addressing Qin Dong with the thin politeness of someone whose world had the authority to reorder other people's days, "if you are implying impropriety on my part, perhaps there is a misunderstanding about the documents." Qin Dong's jaw was not a thing that quivered. He looked squarely at her. "I am implying that documents should be followed," he said, "and that if an agent code appears across both a lab log and a PR chain, we ought to understand why." Wen Qing's team began a low, urgent council of whispers. The cameras lingered on Mei Lin, whose small figure seemed preternaturally bright in the flood of stage lighting. The photograph in her bag felt suddenly too heavy to hold. The secret it kept was swelling into public weight. Xu Jin stepped forward then, not to seize a microphone or to shout down a rival, but to offer the single thing he felt he could, a shape of protection. He laid his hand on Mei Lin's elbow, a gesture that had steadied before, and said, privately enough that only she and the nearest camera might register it, "Speak your truth, Mei Lin, not for the cameras, but for you." Her throat worked. The audience wanted drama, or perhaps they wanted resolution. Mei Lin realized with a clarity that made the world snap into hard focus that the photograph could be read in more than one way. It could be used as evidence against her, or it could be offered as a key to something larger than one night. She pulled the folded photograph from her bag and set it on the podium. The paper was small and ordinary. The buckle gleamed like a punctuation mark in the dim. She looked out at the rows of faces and found, in the crowd's edges, the blurred outline of Mrs. Zhao, whose ticket had been a kindness from a friend, and who now sat with fingers folded as if in prayer. "If you want a story of scandal," Mei Lin said, voice steady now with a strange, weary resolve, "then I can give you one. But I came to be judged for my work, not for my life. If the buckle is evidence, the evidence is also a ledger. It records not only what happened between two people, but where objects traveled, who handled them, and for what purpose." Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the photograph and smoothed it on the podium for everyone to see. The auditorium leaned in, drawn by the simplicity of an image that had been waiting for a frame. The buckle caught the light and flashed like a small sun. On the screen behind her, the technical director hesitated, his cursor still over the email chain, the option to scroll open further revelations a temptation. He could show everything now, the sender, the recipient, the trail that might lead to motive. But to do so would be to use the night as a tribunal. In that pause, Wen Qing smiled a smile that was both harder and more fragile than before. She stepped toward the podium as if to reclaim the narrative. The air was taut as a thread. A voice from the control room, small and not meant to cross the stage except by duty, said, "We should verify with the lab before we publish further." It was a voice that wanted things to be correct, not merely sensational. The auditorium held its breath. Men and women in suits exchanged glances, as if measuring whether to leap. Cameras blinked red, hungry. Mei Lin rested both hands on the photograph. The buckle lay there, indifferent to the glare. She felt the weight of a promise unfold. Xu Jin's voice in her memory, Qindong's quiet rise, Mrs. Zhou's small prayers. She lifted her head and faced the room, ready, at last, to shape what the truth should look like when it walked into the light. She opened her mouth. The words she chose would alter the course of every life in that auditorium. The pause became a vein of sound, and then Mei Lin began to speak. "My name is Mei Lin," she said, and the sound of it steadied her. "I am a conservator. I catalog what others make and what others discard. I did not bring that photograph to scandalize any woman or to make a private moment into a public spectacle. I brought it because the object has a record, and the record does not end where your statement tonight begins." She did not accuse Wenqing with melodrama. She showed facts. From the inner pocket of her jacket, she withdrew a thin stack of printed pages, camera-grammed emails, a photo of a ledger page, a time-stamped lab entry. The auditorium leaned forward, as if the air itself had become a witness. "On March 21st, Mei Lin continued, squaring a page toward the nearest cameras so the feed would catch it, the lab inventory lists item 214B, prototype buckle, custody S. Leo. The handwriting is the same as the lab log's heading. On March 21st, at 1703, someone signed this transfer into external exhibit handling with the notation, for PR display, return 0328. The agent code listed in the ledger, A117, appears again in the PR chain on March 21st at 1705, next to an email addressed to King Design, subject line, loan confirmation, item 214B, Exhibit A. A murmur rose like wind among grass. Wenqing's smile thinned until it was a line. She folded her hands as if to keep them from moving in ways that might betray fear. "The buckle did not simply leave the lab," Mei Lin said. "It passed through hands that are recorded. It came to a place where exhibits are staged and narratives are written. The ledger notes who took custody before it arrived at the event. The ledger names an agent. That agent's code appears in correspondence that answers to a PR liaison at King Design." A murmur rose like wind among grass. Wenqing's smile thinned until it was a line. She folded her hands as if to keep them from moving in ways that might betray fear. "The buckle did not simply leave the lab," Mei Lin said. "It passed through hands that are recorded. It came to a place where exhibits are staged and narratives are written. The ledger notes who took custody before it arrived at the event. The ledger names an agent. That agent's code appears in correspondence that answers to a PR liaison at King Design." She did not say the liaison's name aloud. She did not have to. The implication rippled through the room. Cameras panned toward Wenqing as though the woman were a beacon drawing all light. Qindong's voice, when he spoke, had the precise flatness of someone who preferred archives to accusation. "Can you show the ledger entries?" he asked. His platform meant nothing in a legal sense here, but in public terms it was an order. The control room glanced at one another. The technical director swallowed and reached for a cable that would let him switch the feed. Wenqing's posture shifted. For the first time, she looked small under the lights. She had been taught to fill a room with design rather than to be filled by it. Tonight, the room returned the favor. "There are protocols for provenance," Wenqing said carefully, "and there are privacy laws." "Protocols we follow," Qindong interrupted, "or protocols we create when convenient." "Verification then, Miss Wen. The ledger, the emails, let them speak." A woman near the back, a hand pressed to her mouth, began to sob softly. Mrs. Zhou sat rigid, knuckles white, as though prayerable muscle could steady a trembling world. Mei Lin tapped another page, a photograph of a man's badge clipped to a lanyard. The badge bore a small seal. Mei Lin held it up so the camera could catch the grain of the paper. This badge, she said, was recorded as present at the studio on the afternoon of March 21st at 1658. The ledger shows the buckle checked out at 1700. Whoever signed the ledger had access to both. Wen Qing's council of whispers morphed into a thin, sharp chorus. Her eyes found Xu Jin's in the crowd. He nodded once, a small private encouragement that steadied Mei Lin as surely as his hand had earlier. "Why show this now?" Wen Qing asked. The question was an attempt at reason. In it lay an offer for explanation. "Because the ledger traces a pattern," Mei Lin answered, "and patterns are not accidents. I have seen this object in promotional shoots long after its supposed return date. I have documentation of transfers that never mark a signature of final return. I have photographs with the same buckle in staged frames that correspond to storylines not of conservation but of consumption." Wen Qing's jaw tightened. There was a moment of silence so thick even the microphones seemed to hold their breath. Then Wen Qing moved, but not toward Mei Lin. She adjusted the microphone on its stand as if reclaiming the device, as if control might be regained by voice alone. "Any misunderstanding can be clarified," she said. "If, as you allege, custody records indicate a discrepancy, we will of course cooperate with verification. But let us not turn an internal procedural lapse or an administrative error into character assassination." "Administrative error," Mei Lin repeated softly, and the words tasted of something colder. "If it were only misfiled paper, perhaps. But the ledger connects to payments, reimbursements, a chain of custody that parallels PR agendas. Objects were moved to enhance narratives. People who lent their faces, and perhaps their consent, were never asked for the loan." A hand in the front row lifted a phone. The screen glowed. A dozen others followed. The auditorium became a constellation of small lights. The technical director's finger hovered. His face was an island of indecision. Qin Dong stepped toward the podium, but he did not take it. Instead, he said, in a tone that cut like a file, "We have auditors. We have records. Let the data be alone for a moment while we confirm the facts. If the logs are as you say, Miss Wen, accountability follows. If they are not, then we correct a mistake and apologize." "Administrative error," Mei Lin repeated softly, and the words tasted of something colder. "If it were only misfiled paper, perhaps. But the ledger connects to payments, reimbursements, a chain of custody that parallels PR agendas. Objects were moved to enhance narratives. People who lent their faces, and perhaps their consent, were never asked for the loan." A hand in the front row lifted a phone. The screen glowed. A dozen others followed. The auditorium became a constellation of small lights. The technical director's finger hovered. His face was an island of indecision. Qin Dong stepped toward the podium, but he did not take it. Instead, he said, in a tone that cut like a file, "We have auditors. We have records. Let the data be alone for a moment while we confirm the facts. If the logs are as you say, Miss Wen, accountability follows. If they are not, then we correct a mistake and apologize." Wen Qing's mouth tightened into thin rope. "You will not weaponize conjecture," she said. "It is not conjecture," Mei Lin replied. "It's a ledger and a chain. The buckle is a node." At that, from the dim back of the control room, someone made a choice. The technical director clicked. For an instant, nothing happened. Then the screen behind Mei Lin flickered, and the auditorium was filled with the crisp, small black type of an email header and a scanned ledger page. A collective intake of breath, then a ripple of phone-recorded sound as the audience realized the feed was live. Wen Qing's eyes narrowed. She did not move to stop it. Perhaps she knew she could not. Perhaps, for a moment, she too wanted the ledger to speak. On the screen, a line of text glowed. Loan confirmation, item 214-B, Exhibit A. Agent code A117. Handle with PR liaison, kingdesign_PR at qdesign.cn. A long-held silence shattered as people whispered, as cameras zoomed, as someone in a blue suit stood from his chair with the slow deliberation of someone whose role was to be seen within the theater of crisis. Wen Qing drew a breath that could have been a question or a challenge. Mei Lin folded her hands over the photograph on the podium as if closing a book. Xu Jin's grip on her elbow was the only thing that kept her from swaying. Qin Dong's phone buzzed in his pocket. He read it and then, without looking up, said, "We will verify the server logs, for the sake of fairness and for the sake of truth." Wen Qing's voice was low when she answered. "Do that," she said. "Do it now." Outside, somewhere beyond the glass doors of the auditorium, a small cluster of reporters waited, hungry and patient. Inside, under the lights, the ledger had begun to speak. The room had split on an invisible seam between those who wanted scandal and those who wanted explanation. Mei Lin felt both currents, and, for the first time since the photograph had been taken, possible resolution flickered like a distant lighthouse. She did not know yet whether the ledger would exonerate or condemn. She only knew she had set the record in motion, and that once a record moved, the past could not easily be coaxed back into its pocket. The screen refreshed. An additional file icon appeared. Chain_of custody 3-21.pdf. The auditorium hummed. Wen Qing stood very still, the picture of composure barely masking a tide rising under her calm. Her team circled close, faces drawn like masks. Mei Lin inhaled, fixed her eyes on the audience, and said, very simply, "Let us see the whole chain."